Good evening, dear listeners. Tonight, I invite you to step into the unsettling corners of the mundane, the places where reality thins, and something far darker waits just beyond the light. Have you ever felt it? That faint, prickling sensation at the edge of your awareness, as though someone, or something, is watching you? Perhaps you've brushed it off as a trick of the light or the wandering of an overactive mind. But what if it wasn't? What if the shadow cast behind you wasn't yours? What if it had a life of its own, and a purpose far more sinister than you could ever imagine? Tonight, we bring you the tale of David Calloway, an ordinary man whose life takes an extraordinary and terrifying turn when a shadow begins to follow him. A shadow that doesn't belong. This is The Shadow That Walks. And as you listen, remember, some shadows aren't content to remain in the background. Some want to take center stage. So, settle in. Turn off the lights if you dare, and prepare yourself. Because tonight, your shadow might not be the only one watching. David Calloway had always been an ordinary man. Ordinary job, ordinary apartment, ordinary routines. He worked as an IT consultant in a glass-walled office downtown, ate the same turkey sandwich every day for lunch, and walked home under the glow of streetlights that buzzed faintly in the night air. It was on one of these unremarkable evenings, as he turned the corner toward his apartment complex, that he first noticed the shadow. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the light, a vague outline stretching unnaturally long beneath the glow of the street lamp. He frowned, glancing behind him to find no one there. Yet, the shadow moved. It wasn't his, it couldn't be. He stood still, and the shadow shifted, elongating unnaturally toward him like a finger reaching out. David blinked, shook his head, and dismissed it as a tired mind playing tricks. He had been working late after all. But even as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, a nagging unease followed him. Inside, the hum of his fridge and the low murmur of a late-night news anchor filled the silence. He tossed his keys on the counter and flipped the light switch, flooding the room with fluorescence. For a moment, he felt foolish. There it was, his shadow, stretched naturally against the wall behind him. Nothing strange about it. But as he turned to reach for a glass in the cupboard, he froze. The shadow didn't move. His hand hung in midair, trembling as his eyes darted to the corner of the room where the shadow stood. It was still, unnaturally still, and it didn't match his posture. David's heart thudded in his chest as he waved his hand. The shadow didn't mimic him. Instead, it seemed to tilt its head, observing him. A sharp, icy chill ran down his spine. He stumbled back, knocking the glass from the counter to the floor, where it shattered with a deafening crash. The sound snapped him out of his trance. He turned toward the light switch, frantically flipping it on and off. Bright light, darkness, bright light, darkness. When he finally left the light on, the shadow was gone. For the next few days, David did his best to ignore what he had seen. It was absurd, he told himself, just stress. A hallucination brought on by too many late nights and not enough sleep. But the strange occurrences continued. The following morning, he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror, only to notice a dark smear behind him, like a smudge on the glass. When he turned around, there was nothing there. At work, his coworker Jessica waved at him from the break room and hesitated, her face turning pale. "You okay, David?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Why?" I thought I saw someone standing behind you. Must have been my imagination." Her uneasy laughter did little to reassure him. By the end of the week, David began noticing the shadow everywhere. It lingered just out of reach, never quite fitting into the natural play of light. In his apartment, it would stretch across the walls at impossible angles, even when the room was fully lit. On his nightly walks, it followed him, growing darker and more defined as the days passed. He started avoiding mirrors. He stopped turning off the lights at night. But no matter what he did, the shadow was always there, waiting. One night, desperate for answers, David scoured the internet for anything that might explain what was happening. He read articles about sleep paralysis, shadow people, and even hauntings. None of it felt right. This wasn't a fleeting specter or a figment of his imagination. This thing was deliberate. By midnight, his apartment was bathed in the cold glow of his computer screen. The hum of the building seemed louder than usual, an almost oppressive buzz that pressed against his skull. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion setting in. A soft creak broke the silence. David's head snapped up. The door to his bedroom, which he had left ajar, was now fully open. "Hello," he called, his voice wavering. No response. Heart pounding, he stood and moved cautiously toward the doorway. The light in the hall flickered as he stepped through, and his stomach dropped when he saw it, his shadow, stretched impossibly long down the corridor, standing perfectly still even as he moved. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The shadow twitched. Slowly it began to shift, its edges rippling like water. It leaned forward, a dark mass peeling itself from the floor, and took a step toward him. David stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He fumbled for the light switch, slamming it upward. The hallway flooded with light. The shadow was gone. The next morning, David was a wreck. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale. He hadn't slept a wink, too terrified to close his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. At work, he avoided Jessica and anyone else who might notice his disheveled state. He kept his head down, focusing on his tasks with single-minded determination. But the shadow was relentless. It followed him to the office, lurking in the corners of the brightly lit cubicle. It appeared in the reflection of his computer screen, hovering behind him like a dark stain. That afternoon, as he rode the elevator to the ground floor, he felt it again, the oppressive weight of being watched. He turned slowly, dreading what he might see. There it was, in the mirrored wall of the elevator, a black, shapeless figure standing behind him, where no one else should have been. David bolted as soon as the door slid open, nearly knocking over a delivery man on his way out. "Hey, watch it!" the man yelled, but David didn't stop. He didn't stop until he was back in his apartment, the door bolted shut behind him. He leaned against the door, gasping for air. For the first time, the thought crossed his mind, what does it want? As if in answer, the lights in his apartment flickered. And then, the shadow spoke. The shadow's voice wasn't a voice at all. It was more like a feeling, a suffocating weight pressing against David's chest. It carried no sound, no words, yet it conveyed a clear message: you don't belong. David's legs gave out, and he slid to the floor, his back against the door. The apartment lights flickered, casting the room into an uneasy strobe effect. The shadow, no longer confined to the floor or walls, began to materialize in the center of the room. It was a shape without form, a living ink blot that pulsed and churned like smoke caught in a jar. "Why are you doing this?" David managed to croak, his voice trembling. The shadow rippled, edges blurring and reforming. In its presence, the room felt colder, smaller, like it was collapsing around him. "It's not yours," the feeling pressed into his mind. "It's mine." "What are you talking about?" he whispered. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it surged forward. David scrambled to his feet and stumbled into the kitchen, grabbing the first thing he could find, a steak knife. He pointed it at the shifting darkness, his hand shaking violently. "Stay back," he shouted. The shadow paused, as if considering him. Then it shrank, pulling itself back into a low, dense mass on the floor. For a brief moment, David thought it had retreated, but then it moved, impossibly fast, rushing toward him like a wave. He screamed, throwing himself to the side as the shadow passed through the spot where he had been standing. The knife clattered to the floor. When he looked up, the shadow was gone. David spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch with every light in the apartment turned on. He clutched his phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. Who could he even call? The police? They'd think he was insane. As the hours crawled by, exhaustion eventually overcame him. He drifted into a fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of endless corridors and shadows that whispered his name. When he woke, the apartment was eerily silent. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and for a moment, He allowed himself to believe it was over, but then he noticed his shadow. It was still there, stretched across the floor in the harsh morning light, but something was wrong. It wasn't quite aligned with his movements. When he stood up, it hesitated for half a second before following. When he raised his hand, it mirrored the motion, but with a jerkiness that made his stomach churn. And its edges were darker, sharper. David knew he couldn't stay in the apartment. He packed a bag with whatever he could grab and left, locking the door behind him. At first, David tried to go about his day as if nothing had happened. He went to work, sat through meetings, and answered emails, but the shadow wouldn't leave him alone. It was there in the fluorescent-lit office, creeping along the walls. It appeared in the reflection of the coffee machine, twisting and writhing like it was alive. By lunchtime, he couldn't take it anymore. He left the office and began wandering the streets, hoping the sunlight would chase it away. But even under the harsh midday sun, the shadow clung to him, impossibly dark against the pavement. Desperate, he ducked into a crowded cafe, hoping to lose himself in the noise and bustle. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching people pass by. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax. But then he noticed something strange. People were staring at him. Not just glancing, but stopping in their tracks and staring with wide, frightened eyes. A woman spilled her drink as she backed away, her lips moving as if to say something. A man crossed himself before hurrying out the door. David turned to look at his reflection in the window. The shadow wasn't behind him anymore. It was on him. It clung to his body like a second skin, its edges writhing and shifting. His reflection didn't look human. It was a dark, twisted silhouette with hollow eyes that seemed to stare back at him. "No," he whispered, his hands trembling. He stumbled out of the cafe, ignoring the startled gasps and whispers of the patrons. That night, David checked into a motel on the edge of town. The room was small and dingy, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. But it was away from people, away from the stares and whispers. He locked the door and covered the windows with towels and blankets, blocking out every sliver of light. Then he sat in the middle of the room, a single lamp casting a dim circle of light around him. The shadow was still there, sitting just outside the lamp's glow. It no longer pretended to be his. It moved on its own, stretching and shifting across the walls like a predator circling its prey. David clutched his head, his thoughts spiraling. What did it want? Why wouldn't it leave him alone? As the hours dragged on, the shadow began to creep closer, inching toward the edge of the light. David watched in terror as it moved, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You can't have me," he whispered, his voice cracking. The shadow paused. Then slowly, it began to rise, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. Its head tilted, as if studying him. "But you are already mine." The words echoed in his mind, freezing him in place. The shadow lunged. David's scream echoed through the tiny motel room as the shadow collided with him. It wasn't like being touched by something solid. It was worse, like stepping into ice-cold water while an invisible weight crushed his chest. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his vision swimming with darkness. The shadow seemed to pour into him, seeping under his skin, filling every corner of his mind. Memories flickered like broken film reels, moments from his childhood, his first day at work, the quiet monotony of his daily routine. The shadow wasn't just invading him, it was becoming him. David clawed at the floor, desperate to hold on to himself. "Get out," he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. The shadow's voice, cold and deliberate, echoed in his mind. "You don't belong here anymore." When David opened his eyes, he was alone. The motel room was silent, bathed in the dim glow of the lamp. For a moment, he thought it was over. The oppressive weight was gone, and he could breathe again. But something was wrong. His hands trembled as he raised them, staring at his skin. It looked normal, pale and faintly calloused, the hands of someone who spent too much time at a keyboard. Yet they felt wrong, heavy. He staggered to the bathroom and flipped on the light. The man in the mirror wasn't him. David's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the reflection. It looked like him, same brown hair, same tired eyes. But there was something off. The way the figure stood, the slight tilt of its head, the faint curl of its lips. It was like looking at a photograph that had been subtly altered, just enough to set off alarm bells in his mind. He raised a trembling hand to the mirror. The reflection hesitated for a fraction of a second before mimicking the motion. "No," David whispered, his voice cracking. He stumbled back, clutching his head. "No, no, no!" The figure in the mirror smiled. Over the next few days, David tried to convince himself it wasn't real. He avoided mirrors, stayed away from reflective surfaces, and avoided his own shadow like the plague, but it was no use. The shadow had taken something from him, his reflection, his sense of self. He felt it in the way people looked at him, their eyes narrowing with suspicion or fear. Even Jessica, who had always been friendly, seemed uneasy around him now. "You look different," she said one afternoon, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm fine," David replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But she didn't look convinced. It wasn't long before David started noticing the other changes. His shadow no longer followed him the way it should. Instead, it moved independently, lagging behind or stretching at odd angles. Sometimes it would stop entirely, standing still even as he walked. His reflection was worse. In store windows and puddles on the sidewalk, it watched him with a strange, almost predatory gaze. David stopped going to work. He barely ate, barely slept. He spent his days in his apartment, pacing the floor and staring at the walls. The shadow was always there, lurking in the corners of his vision, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. And then, one night, it spoke again. The voice came from the darkness, soft and cold. "You can't fight it." David froze, his heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" "I already told you," the voice said. "You don't belong here." The lights flickered, and David's breath caught as the shadow began to materialize in the center of the room. It was larger now, more defined, with a vague humanoid shape. "Why me?" he whispered. The shadow tilted its head. "Because you were easy." David's stomach churned. "What does that mean?" "You lived a life that didn't matter, a life no one will miss." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back, shaking his head. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" The shadow surged forward, and David braced himself for the same icy sensation he'd felt before. But this time, it stopped just short of touching him. "You've been replaced," it said. "Go see for yourself." David didn't want to go. He wanted to stay in his apartment, surrounded by the only sense of familiarity he had left. But the shadow's words gnawed at him, an itch he couldn't ignore. Late that night, he left the apartment and walked the familiar route to his office building. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with the promise of rain. When he arrived, he hesitated outside the glass doors. His own distorted reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed and pale. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The elevator ride felt endless, the soft hum of machinery filling the silence. When the doors slid open, he froze. Through the glass walls of the office, he saw himself. The other David was sitting at his desk, laughing with Jessica as if nothing had happened. He looked healthier, more confident, more alive. David's stomach turned. He pressed a hand to the glass, staring in disbelief. "That's not possible," he whispered. The shadow's voice echoed in his mind, cold and unrelenting. "You were easy to replace." The next few days passed in a blur. David wandered the city, unable to sleep or eat. He was a ghost, invisible to everyone around him. Even the reflection in the mirror seemed to mock him now, its smile growing wider and more sinister. One night, as he sat alone in his dark apartment, the shadow appeared again. "It's time," it said. David looked up, his eyes hollow. "For what?" "To go." The shadow surged forward, and this time, David didn't fight it. When Jessica arrived at work the next morning, she noticed something strange. David's desk was empty, his computer turned off. She frowned, glancing around. "Has anyone seen David?" she asked. Her co-workers exchanged puzzled looks. "David who?" one of them asked. Jessica blinked, her brow furrowing. "David Calloway. He works in IT." The man shrugged. "Sorry, never heard of him." Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. For some reason, she couldn't picture David's face anymore. A chill ran down her spine as she turned back to her computer. On the edge of her vision, just outside the fluorescent glow of her desk lamp, a shadow lingered. It tilted its head, watching. And so, dear listeners, the shadow has taken its place, leaving us to wonder, when the lights go out, will your shadow still belong to you? David Calloway's fate is a chilling reminder that some things aren't meant to be understood, only endured or succumbed to. But don't get too comfortable just yet. The darkness has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. And next week, we'll delve into another tale, a story so ghastly, so spine-chilling, it might just leave you sleeping with the lights on. So, gather your courage and join us again, same time, same place, for another journey into the macabre. Until then, keep an eye on the shadows, and whatever may be lurking within them. Sweet dreams, if you dare.